Welcome to the 11 a.m. session. Very quickly, before we introduce the next speaker, just want to make you aware that and invite you to participate in an interactive map project when this session is over. And this project is an opportunity for you to think about how you specifically, uniquely connect with the land that's important to you in your location and land that you might not have thought about before. So our next speaker is Desi Lin, and she is a member of the Dene Nation who started teaching special education in an elementary school in her hometown of Page, Arizona. This teaching position motivated Desi to obtain a Master of Education focusing on indigenous epistemologies. After teaching in Arizona and Alaska, and began teaching at Utah Valley University in 2011. Desi currently works with the National Indian Education Association as the Educator Initiative Manager. She leads efforts to support and retain educators that serve Native students. Her presentation today is Understanding Land from a Native American Perspective. Please join me in welcoming Desi Lin.
Good morning, Yat e bine. I'm going to introduce myself in my Navajo language to start off with. Yat e she Desi Lin Yinishia. Edish Gishni Nishle, Bilagana Bashichin, Kia Ani Dashache, Do Bilagana Dashanella, She Shlat Sha'achine, Beshage Detnasha. My name is Desi Lin. My full name is Emma Desba Lin. My first name comes from my mom. She was originally named Daja, and when she was taken to boarding school, they gave her the white name Emma, which she then gave to me. My middle name is Desba, which means a woman who is preparing to go to war. I'm always preparing, not always going, which is great for a lot of people, I think. I'm originally from an area called Coppermine, Arizona, just south of Page, Arizona. So if any of you have been to Lake Powell, Wahweap, Antelope Point, that is my hometown. Although my experience there was probably completely different than most people's tourist or lake experiences there. I grew up on the Navajo Nation just south of there. I grew up without running water and electricity, and went to school. My entire K-12 experience there with that experience, which really changed the way I see education and education equity in spaces for Native students. I currently teach in the English department. I teach an English 1010 course that focuses on writing for social change in Native communities. So our students look at Native communities that they come from and try to find proposals or solutions to some of the things that they can invest in or contribute to, and to be able to go back to their communities and invest in their own communities. So on that note, I'm also from the Tzedishkijni, or the Split Rock and Towering House clan. I have been here at UVU, like she mentioned, since 2011, and I love UVU. I really, really, really love being here. It's an incredible institution, and I am very happy to be here. Okay, all right. I'm going to move on to land acknowledgement, and I do this with a little trepidation because I know that land acknowledgements have had their time and also come with a few conflicts. Dr. Jolie Proudfit from University of California State, San Bernardino, mentioned that when people do land acknowledgements, sometimes it's interesting because it's like people who have a really, really nice car, and they're driving around this really, really nice car that they stole from somebody else, and then they like to say they want to acknowledge that they have a really nice car that they stole from somebody else. So some people view land acknowledgements in that way. I personally just love to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute indigenous tribes in this area, as well as the ancestral territory of the Dene people. I'm grateful for those who have come before us and the experiences that they've had in this land, and for the sacrifices that they have made for us to be able to have the success that we have on this land. These last three questions I usually ask because with an acknowledgement, we also need to ask ourselves about our accountability for the lands that we are on. We can't just acknowledge that we are on Native lands. We also have to be accountable to the reciprocity that we owe for the lands that we are on. A couple of questions that I like to ask my audience is, how has your success come at the cost of the lands that you are on right now? Which was not just a loss of land, but a loss of life, loss of communities, loss of languages. Our ancestral people have paid a very high cost for you to be in these spaces. How can we return cultural autonomy of these ancestral lands to these nations? What does that look like in the space that you are in? How do we support their sovereignty and their stewardship where they are, as well as here? And I ask this generally, I speak in a lot of different places with my role as with the National Indian Education Association, but I often ask what treaty rights should be upheld in this space or in the areas that the state of Utah shares geography with the Native nations. So I just want to give you just a second to think about this before I move on to the next portion. I would also like to make a note that I will be using a lot of different terms to refer to our peoples, such as native nations, indigenous, tribal nations, tribes, nations. All of these different terms I will be using throughout my presentation to refer to the ancestral and present peoples that are either federally recognized, state recognized, or are seeking recognition in the man-made boundaries of the United States. Okay, so the subject that I am sharing about is the importance of land identity, what land means to tribal nations. The first thing that I want to emphasize is this land is who we are and has been since time immemorial. Land is a part of our identity and always has been a part of our identity. It will continue to be a part of our identity. It contributes to the defining characteristics of our identities, our cultural identities, and who we are as communities. If you have the privilege of hearing creation stories, you will hear and understand that the land is a key foundation to our existence. Our deities and our the special holy people who have given us these lands exist in these stories, and they are directly connected to the lands. Our pedagogical practices and the way we teach, the way we learn, the way we survive and live are connected and rooted in the lands that we are from. The relationship of Native peoples' identities, communities, cultures, and languages are all rooted in the land. And it has been this way, and it will be for time immemorial, since time immemorial, and will continue. I do also want to acknowledge that I'm approaching this from the perspective that we, because we have existed since time immemorial, our story predates the colonizer story. Our story and our lives and our existences have predated Columbus or any other explorers that have come here. They will continue after, regardless of what happens. The fact that our existence has predated all of the historical aspects that we know regarding Western society establishes that we have been here since time immemorial, and also establishes that identity to the land. I often tell people that the story of history that you're familiar with is a small chapter of our story, because we've been here this whole time, and we have other chapters coming. This land is who we are and has been since time immemorial. A Navajo term, Ta'ati Kohonidlo, means we are still here. We continue to remain here. One of the biggest challenges that we face is antiquation and erasure. We are often portrayed as ancient peoples, black and white photographs. But I'm standing in front of you, Forrest Kutch has stood in front of you to prove to you that we are a dominant presence in our cultures and our spaces in the land that we are on. The land is who we are, and it will not change. No amount of policy, genocide, cultural, spiritual, or linguistic genocidal or forced removals will change that connection to our land. There has been a disruption in many cases and in many places, and we can see the repercussions of that. I will go over those a little bit later in what I share. But the spiritual connection to the land is ours, and it will not be severed. I want to give you an example of I want to start off with an example of a community that has existed actually longer than Western scientists can date it. The Acoma Pueblo is the longest continuously inhabited community. This community is a standing example of how we have existed prior to colonization, prior to Western impact, and we continue to exist and thrive, not just exist. Western scientists have dated it to at least 1150 AD, but we also know that Western science can be limited in what they can find. Our communities know that we have been on this land since. We don't need a date. We don't need science to tell us that we have been here this whole time. Moving on, I want to go into the impact of land and what land means. I want to establish, or I hoped to establish, the fact that land is our identity and it's who we are. Spiritually, culturally, linguistically, we belong to the land. In addition to that, the intersections of people on our lands have been at the heart of every conflict and relationship between Native peoples and colonizers, as well as between Native peoples and other Native peoples. If you look at many of the aspects or the eras of policy that we have been through in our history in the United States, you can see that every single one of them has had some impact with land. With contact. It was a literal arrival on land from the ocean, right? It was their arrival on land, our land. Okay, thanks. You guys are throwing me off. Just kidding, it's fine. Okay, with pre-colonization and that era of pre-colonization, the colonizers were trying to survive off of the land, and many did not. But their survival their survival occurred because of our knowledges of the land and indigenous efforts to support the colonizers that came. Colonization and that process of colonization was an effort to dominate the land. All of the policies that were put in place had to do with control over land or removal of land or the ability to access land. Removal as well as relocation, those two different eras. Forced removal of people off of their lands had to do with land and being able for colonizers to be able to access land. In addition to the relocation era, when hundreds of Native nations were asked to leave their reservations to come to cities like Salt Lake City or Denver or Minneapolis or Oakland. Again, it was a removal or a disconnect from land. Assimilation. The whole process of assimilation has been the attempt to sever the connection that we have had with land. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a little bit later. But each period had arranged agreements for existence on and use of land with treaties, promises, and policies. So every single era that we've been through as Native peoples has had some type of connection to the lands that we come from and the lands that are used. In addition to that, I wanted to share this quick quote because it demonstrates the perspective of what Europeans saw here when they arrived. This book is from The Great Father, a book called The Great Father by Prucha. He states, there was much theoretical discussion about the rights of the savage, non-Christian peoples to the land they occupied, about whether the Indians and similar people could claim lands against Christian nations, and the idea that the lands in the New World were a vacuum domicilium, a wasteland open for the taking, and that view had wide acceptance. This perspective of the land contrasted very differently from the indigenous perspective of the land, right? A wasteland to be taken versus a part of our identity and who we are and our spiritual connection to our spaces. In addition to that, Europeans claimed land as a way, and as they came onto this land, the way they claimed land was a way to demonstrate to other European nations that their presence was long-term and that they owned the land that they were on. It was not a way of claiming land towards the tribal nations that were present in those spaces. The Indian white systems of land tenure were quite different. The Indians had a notion of communal ownership of the land. The English, one of individual ownership in fee simple. Neither fully understood the concept of the other. So this clash of views on the land created so many different conflicts that came after this. I wanted to add a note that in this quote, I share that the Indians had a notion of communal ownership of the land, and I wanted to correct that to explain that the land had ownership of the community. The communities had a reciprocal relationship with the land, and that ownership was actually a Western concept for Indigenous peoples. With those intersections of land, there were different reasons for the land dispossession and taking away the lands from these supposed savages upon arrival of colonizers. One of the main reasons was the Christianization of the lands and peoples. The process of civilization at that time was commonly known to be this sequential order of Humans came as barbaric nomads. They eventually led to agriculturalists who were a little bit more civilized than the nomads, and then eventually became humans that could live in cities. This process of civilization is what guided the policy for several hundred years for Native Americans and the relationships with tribal communities. Because Native peoples and their identity was often seen as these barbaric nomads that may or may not have had rights and ownership to these lands. This concept was also something that was established with this inherent God-given right to cultivate the land, and that as good Christian people, that cultivation had to occur, and if it didn't, then the people who were on the land that could not or would not cultivate the land would have to forfeit the land as a violation of God's will, which would leave space for other more civilized cultures to come in to be agriculturalists in these spaces. Another reason for land dispossession was really simply practicality. People needed to survive when they arrived here. They needed food, they needed farmlands, they needed to be able to trade, they needed the resources of the land. So there were two different reasons for land dispossession, and that intersections of land upon arrival. I wanted to ask you all these questions to think about. When you look at land and your connection to land and how you use land, and how it's connected to your own identity, how much of your life and what you do is devoted to the acquisition of land or for the use of land, whether that's personally or professionally? If you think about your careers, if you think about your lifestyles or your recreation or your pursuits and your goals, how often or how does that occur on land? Does it require the acquisition of land? And how does it use land in order to meet those goals personally and professionally? I also wanted to ask, how have we been trained in our current society, in our current education systems, our economic systems, to perpetuate the notion of land as owned property? And how does that affect us as individuals? From this point, now that I've established kind of those different concepts of land and how land is viewed as from a Native American perspective versus the earlier colonizers' perspective, I want to move into a few different aspects of identity and how that intersection or those conflicts led to varying definitions or aspects of identity for Native communities. And I just want to preface this. I know that in a lot of conversations about Native communities, it's often seen as this sequential order from the Western perspective, right? That we start with contact, and then after that, this happened, and then after that, this happened, and then after that. I don't want to view it from that sequential perspective. I'm actually going to look at it from 4 different cases of law that had an impact at the time that they occurred, and those impacts continue today on how we identify ourselves as Native Americans and Native communities. So, the first one, Johnson versus McIntosh of 1823. During this, which how many of you have heard of the Marshall Trilogy? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. One person. Awesome. Okay. So the 3 that I'm going to cover now are from the Marshall Trilogy. 3 very, very, very relevant cases that impact Native identity and the intersections of land between the 2 communities. The first one is Johnson versus McIntosh. So what happened is a man named Johnson bought land from the Piankashaw tribe. So the tribe said, "We live here, we're from here, we'll give you this land." And he was like, "Great, I'll buy it." So he bought it. A little bit later on, William McIntosh came in and he got the same piece of land from the US federal government. So 2 different entities sold the same piece of land to 2 different men. And both of them are like, that's not gonna work. So they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that in the middle of all of this, their question was, who should get the land? Should it be Johnson, who bought it from the tribe, or should it be McIntosh, who bought it from the US government? Who has the right to sell this land? The result was that tribes were given occupancy right to the land, that they did not have the ability to sell land because they were not able to own it. This established the doctrine of discovery, with colonizers as the discoverers and Native peoples as tenants of the land, which is very different, right, compared to the identities that we identify with from the start, our connection, our spiritual connection. We are not tenants of the land, we are stewards of the land with spiritual and emotional connections to the land. So this case determined that as Native peoples, we were seen as tenants of the land. This was 1823. Moving on to 1831, which in 1823, that's what they used during that time to kind of determine what choices were made. Several years later, we had the state of Georgia come in with the Cherokee Nation on their lands. And of course, the state of Georgia was like, we could use that land. We actually really want that land. How do we get that land? Because the Cherokee Nation couldn't sell it to them as tenants, the state of Georgia decided a different route. They imposed state laws on the Cherokee Nation. They decided that the Cherokee Nation would no longer be a nation, but would just be different parts of different counties in the state of Georgia. So they divided it up and they said, you are now all under Georgia state law. And the Cherokee Nation said, no, we're not. We don't want to be under state law. We are a Cherokee Nation, which, if any of you know about the Cherokee Nation, is one of the 5 civilized tribes. They had their own syllabary, form of reading alphabet that was based on syllables. They had their own newspaper. They had their own federal government, or just government, their national government, to represent their tribal nation. They did as much as they could to demonstrate that they were not part of the barbaric nomads that they were labeled as, right? So the Cherokee Nation went to the Supreme Court and said, we are a foreign nation. State laws cannot apply to us because we're a foreign nation. Well, the Supreme Court denied their case and said that they were actually a domestic dependent nation. Or, in other words, they were seen as a ward to a guardian. So the identity has gone from tenants to wards to a guardian. Several years later, we have the Worcester versus Georgia case in 1830. Sorry, not several years, 1 year. 1 year later, we have Worcester versus Georgia. So with those state laws that Georgia put over the Cherokee Nation, one of the laws was that religious people could not go onto the Cherokee Nation or this land without a specific license to proselyte. Well, Samuel Worcester and a partner were like, we don't want to do that. We're going to go in, we're going to proselyte, we're going to be part of this tribe, and we want to Christianize them because we're good people that do that. So they went into this space and basically were living among the Cherokee Nation, and the state of Georgia found out and arrested them. Arrested Worcester and the other missionary that was with him that were preaching on Cherokee lands without that license. So Worcester filed suit against Georgia saying that those licenses should not be valid on Cherokee lands. The result was the federal government stated that the Cherokee Nation occupied its territory. They revoked the state laws or the state force of Georgia, and tribes had tribal sovereignty. This case was relevant because it continues today. This is why Native nations are not just a racial entity, we are a political entity. We are part of this triad of the American family of governments, with the federal government working with the federal government, also working with state governments as tribal nations. So we went from being tenants to wards of the state to having tribal sovereignty, and we continue to exist in this state, in this land with a government-to-government relationship with the other 2 sovereign governing bodies of the United States. These 3 cases established how we exist as tribal nations. We are more than just people of color. We have a political status, which actually exempts us from a lot of the different racial issues that come up or policies that come up within the state or federally, regardless of what those are. The last one that I wanted to come up with, or that I wanted to talk about, hold on, let me go back. This took a while to kind of settle in and to be established. Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, basically told Johnson that Marshall, that he needed to reinforce what he decided. So if this is what he decided for the Cherokee Nation, then he can reinforce it. At the same time, they were trying to reinforce the forced removal of the tribal nations in that area in order for states to access those lands. As a result of this, as a result of this, the Cherokee Nation was not able to practice that tribal sovereignty in their space because of the push for that forced removal. The Cherokee Nation at this time had one group of people that accepted the offer to move to Oklahoma from Georgia. So they sent somebody out to Oklahoma. That person looked at the area, they found a space for their people, or they decided that the space was acceptable. They went back to the Cherokee Nation and said, yeah, it's okay, we'll take it, let's go. So a small group of people left the Cherokee Nation and went and settled in Oklahoma in land that was offered them. At this time, John Ross, the president of the chief of the Cherokee Nation, was fighting with the Supreme Court with all these cases, trying to say, like, we belong here, we don't want to go. Georgia should not be pushing us out. Didn't really get the results that they wanted, regardless of the long-term effect of this case, and decided to accept a treaty to leave their Cherokee Nation in Georgia for Oklahoma. So the second group, which is the larger group, left and went out to Oklahoma to join the first group. That group is what most people know as the Trail of Tears, but of course there were 5 civilized tribes and multiple Trail of Tears that occurred across the country. This is one of the most popular ones. After those people left, a small group of Cherokee remained because they tried to be as defiant as they could. They did not want to leave. They didn't want to go anywhere. They didn't believe what was happening with the policies that were in place, and so they stayed as long as they could until they were literally forced by the military to leave. So they eventually left. So there were 3 different groups of Cherokee nations that went out to Oklahoma. Once the first group got there, they did their best to try to establish themselves on the land and to reconnect with the land that they were on, right? They brought as much as they could from their previous area of education, scholarship, their syllabary, they brought as much as they could. The second group with John Ross, who had signed the treaty, came over, and the first group was like, whoa, you guys just got here, and now you want to like move in on the space that we have here? And it started to create this intertribal conflict because of the new land that they were on. So it took a little bit of time for that second group to transition to the same space as the first group. The third group, the most defiant group, got to Oklahoma, and they were not happy about the results of everything that occurred. They were not happy and they didn't want to be there, and they were actually kind of angry with John Ross, who signed the treaties. Within 6 months of that group, the third group, being in Oklahoma, the 4 tribal leaders that signed the treaty to accept the removal, out of those 4, 3 of them they mysteriously died within 6 months of the arrival of that third group of Cherokee from Georgia. The 4th disappeared, and nobody knows where that person went. There was no investigation or anything into how the 3 leaders were mysteriously died. But I use that as an example of, even with the successes and the impact of identity on our peoples, there was also conflict within tribal nations that occurred because of land and the intersections of land and native identity. Lastly, the 4th one that I want to cover is Standing Bear versus Crook. So the Ponca Reservation in Nebraska was actually a land that was guaranteed by the federal government, but as the Ojibwe, with removal and impact, pushed out the Sioux Nation into their territory. In 1865, the US government said, this is your reservation, you guys can have this land. But then 3 years later, they ceded the entire reservation to the Sioux Nation. The Ponca and the Sioux had been historically rival nations. So instead of the federal government saying, oh, sorry, we'll give it back, they said, we'll give you new territory down in Oklahoma. You guys can just head to Oklahoma. So they had the military escort them down to Oklahoma in 1877. After a couple of years there, the Ponca Nation was not happy with the situation that they were in, and Chief Standing Bear decided that he wanted to go back to his traditional homelands. He had made a promise to bury his son, but also they just didn't want to be there. They left, they made it to Nebraska, where they were detained because they weren't supposed to leave the reservation that they were assigned. They were detained, which led to a court case where Standing Bear versus Crook established that they didn't, as Indian people were human beings, that they were a person within the meaning of the laws of the United States. And that was kind of the determining factor. So we've gone from tenants to words of a guardian to sovereign tribal nations to now persons. So these had an impact on who we are as our native identity, but also we're all connected to intersections of not just colonizers and native nations, but also intertribal relations. Just to clarify, reservations are often seen as land that is given to tribal nations. They are not. Within the conversations about land and where we ended up, reservations are what was reserved for ourselves. It's not a reservation that the US government reserved for us. We reserved that for ourselves, and we gave up everything else. Another quick quote. from a book called To Remain an Indian by Shanae Nolomowaima and Teresa McCarty. It states that throughout the history of the United States, the treatment of Native Americans has been the canary in the coal mine that revealed the extent to which the United States was realizing or contradicting the ideals stated in its founding documents that people have a right to happiness and inalienable rights. In addition to that, Dr. Cajete has stated, actually, this is more of a demonstration of after all of these different, which I touched on 4 cases. There are hundreds of cases and treaties and policies that have been put into place statewide, federally. I chose 4. So I think all of you should get a minor in American Indian Studies here at UVU, because it's actually pretty amazing to learn more about this. But I just chose 4 as a brief intro to the impact on land. The legacies of that, I think, Forrest Ketch talked a little bit about it: poverty, disease, personal tragedies, dysfunctional behavior, other forms of loss, historic trauma, traceable to each community's unique experience of colonization, and those stories are not told. 87% of state standards stop telling the history of Native Americans in 1900. There are no state standards after that in the other 13% of state standards around Native Americans. 27 states don't mention a single Native American in their state standards, in their content. So these stories are not told, but what we do see and what we are exposed to is these harsh legacies of the historic trauma that our peoples have been to. When I mentioned earlier that disconnect occurred, that there was a disruption in our spiritual connection to our land, these are the repercussions of that, and these are the legacies of the policies, the cases, the treaties, the broken treaties that were put in place that were an attempt to force to sever that connection to these lands. And the reason why I don't focus on this, you can Google this, you can look up suicide rates or you can look up any aspect of this trauma, and it's out there. Those numbers are out there. Dropout rates, college success rates, different types of abuse. Even if you just look up the historical trauma of boarding schools, that's a rabbit hole that you can go down to just learn so much about all of this, which I don't want to touch on because I want to focus on the fact that there is an untangling that is occurring now, that we are in and continue this rebirth and reconnection of who we are to our lands. I don't want to say that this ever was fully successful. In fact, multiple people have said, actually, let me go to this quote: despite its professed inevitability, settler colonialism in North America is a project of perpetual failure and imminent crisis. Every era of policy in the history of the United States has failed. Extermination and the attempts to destroy us, eradicate us, erase us, they didn't work because our people are still here. And we continue to thrive. We're not here like hanging on by a thread. Like, we are thriving people with amazing, beautiful communities. So despite the inevitability of colonialism, it was perpetually a failure. Which led to the era that we're in of sovereignty, our own ability to make our decisions about ourselves the way we want to in regards to education, land use, hopefully, usually, not always. This resurgence of going back to our land and reclaiming our land is something that is ongoing today. I want to give an example of one story of the reclamation of identity and land. This is from the Hoopa Valley and Northern California. The Yurok, Kuruk nations in this space have, in this territory of Northern California, one of the interesting things that I learned about them is that their cultural identity and connection to land is they have a high school mascot that is the Warriors, of course. Go figure, right? A Native American school with a mascot of the Warriors. But in reality, what we learned from Melody George Moore, who is a cultural teacher, as well as I think a math teacher in their local high school, their cultural identity is not one of fighters or warriors or like people that want to go out and fight. Their traditional identity was actually one of people who would barter and trade. The leader of the community was the one who was able to barter or trade the best and obtain the most resources from the land from the different people that he worked with. In fact, the leader would stockpile the resources that he gained from all the bartering that he did within the tribe. At some point, he would obtain so much that he would have to give it all out. So then they would have a big feast or a big gathering. And during that gathering, everything that he had bartered for and collected, he would redistribute and give back to the community that he was a leader over. So it was interesting when we were talking with Melody, we went into this, into their places of ceremony, and we had these conversations about who they are as people and the fact that they are traders and barterers and not warriors, and what that means for them to return to that identity. Another interesting aspect was her sister is the superintendent of the school district, Jennifer Lane, and she brought us to this place and shared with us that Western scientists had come in and had done like a core sample of the pit, this fire pit that has been here for as long as people can remember. And she said, my people and myself are predated back to 10,000 years ago. And the carbon dating that they used was able to show that, but she said again, we could have told them that from the very beginning. We've known all along. We didn't need science to tell us that we've been here this whole time. Returning to that identity and that connection to the land, there were several dams that were built across the Klamath River that stopped the flow of salmon. The Hoopa Valley and the Kurok peoples have a connection to the river and the salmon in the river. One of their stories talks about a basket that went down the river with each community that it passed. The people in that community would pull the basket out of the river, add supplies or things to it, take what they needed, and then send it back down the river. They are all connected by this river. So several dams were put into place that stopped the flow of the salmon and the flow of the river. After several years of bartering and working, the dams are being deconstructed, which this is actually very recent, but I wanted to share that this is something that is occurring in lots of different spaces. If you've heard about DAPL, or if you've heard about what's happening with the Navajo Nation and poisonous materials that are being transported across the Navajo Nation and the people that are trying to stop it, my challenge to you is look into how this land sovereignty or the movement of land back is occurring. How are we regaining the access to our stewardship over the land? That healing process has to occur for our peoples as well as the land. In addition to that, revitalization and that connection to land requires that reconnection to the land or that connection to land. That untangling requires education sovereignty for us to be able to teach our own children what needs to be taught. The Western system and the concept of four-roomed classroom does not meet the needs of our students and doesn't contribute to our cultural identity. Place-based learning and the importance that wisdom sits in places, as Keith H. Basso noted in his book. We belong to the land, our teaching is in the land, the pedagogical practices that we use to teach our children is rooted in the land. Education sovereignty is our ability to reestablish that or rekindle that. It is also important for the revitalization of our languages in these spaces. Natana Greendeer is the director of a culture-based Montessori school in Maine, and she stated, "The language isn't gone here. The trees still know their name in our language. We haven't lost the meaning to those things. We just don't remember the words for them. Coming back to our languages is so healing. There is healing we didn't know we needed. That healing is not just for our communities, it is also for the land, because the land wants us to be the stewards over it, because we know that we can be the ones to take care of it and love it and protect it in the way that it should be, that it is not something to be owned. It is not something to be exploited. that it is a spiritual connection to who we are as Native peoples. I am at time. Thank you.
Beautiful. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If you all have a question, raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you so that it will pick up on the audio for the live stream. And we'll just turn it over to you.
Not all at once, please.
Well, first, thank you so much for your presentation. It was incredible. I didn't know about the Marshall Trilogy and like the ongoing, law. My question has to do with like the kufiya I'm wearing, and I wanted to just know your kufiya is the Palestinian headscarf that I'm wearing, and I just want to know your opinion on what's going on in Palestine and how it relates to land, indigenous relationships to land, and all of that.
So I sometimes teach an Introduction to American Indian Studies course, and the focus of the course is on patterns of behavior of colonization. That colonization is something that has occurred, and it didn't go away. It's not like all of a sudden we're in this sovereign era of rejuvenation, and all of a sudden colonization doesn't exist. In fact, one of the things that we try to talk about is that concept of decolonization, right? To look internally at the ways of thinking and the ways of teaching that have been ingrained in us that reinforce the colonizers' process of relationships and concepts of land. But that process of decolonization is the responsibility of it lies on the people who are colonized, right? In addition to that decolonization that we have to do, there's the desettling that has to occur by colonizers. Colonizers have to stop colonizing, and that hasn't happened, and it hasn't. There hasn't been an impetus to put the onus of that responsibility on colonizers yet. What's happening in Palestine, in my personal opinion, is a continuation of those patterns of behavior of acquiring land and taking over land at the expense of the land and at the expense of the peoples that are on it. It's not new, it has occurred before, and like I said, that concept of desettling has not occurred yet. And it's a huge task to ask of colonizers and Western civilization, and they have no need to really do it at this time because everything in the system benefits them in a way that there's really no need for it. But my thoughts on it are just that it's a continuation of the colonizing practices that have existed, that our people are a result of, that we have experienced, and a lot of Native nations have explained. It looks and feels very familiar to what we've experienced ourselves. Yeah.
So my question is probably not a little bit to do with this. So how do you feel about them pretty much removing the names of like Native Americans from like everything? Like Squaw Peak, they changed the name to some numbers and letters. Like, what the heck is with that?
Every area that you go to has Native names and have Native stories related to them and connected to them. The term squaw is actually very derogatory and offensive. It's like gross and ugly. If you Google it, I'm sure you'd find it. I would love if the majority of the names of the places were returned to the ancestral names that were originally named for them so that people could understand the relevance of those spaces, right? Just the term Squaw Peak has a connotation that's negative when really like this space is a spiritual place. Returning those names I think is important, and it's great progress in my opinion. There are already a lot of names that are Native names. Manhattan and Seattle are Native names. So some names are names that are derived from tribal spaces, Utah. So looking at some of those things, if we return to what their names already were, then we will be able to understand the relevance of these spaces and have more respect for them and the meaning that they hold. I actually am happy that Squaw Peak was changed to Kiev Peak. I personally hate saying the previous name and did my best not to say it beforehand, but I prefer Kiev Peak over what was there before. The way that a lot of these places were named also were just kind of willy-nilly, let's call it Johnson Canyon. Like it wasn't, there was like no real significance to it in many cases. So I'm happy with the name changes that have occurred. But I do also think that as a follow-up to those names being changed, there has to be an explanation for what they mean and why they have been changed and what that means for non-natives as well as natives. That's a good question.
So my question kind of comes from a legal standpoint. It's very interesting learning about the trilogy or like the development of how Native Americans are seen as a political entity. And I'm just curious as to how Native Americans identify in a personal matter for nationality in a sense, right? Because they are reserved, they have the reserves on the territory of the United States of America, but then they have their own centralized governments, which is a beautiful thing. Just how does that work on a political, legal kind of perspective?
It actually puts a lot of responsibility on teachers to teach Native students their civic responsibility, because they not only have a state responsibility and a federal responsibility, they have a tribal responsibility to their tribal nations, right? Which of course is not always taught. The concept of tribal governments is fairly new in the timeline of things, and so tribal governments in their spaces have the power they hold the same power as state governments and federal governments, but their ability to use it and implement it is something that we are still learning about. But as far as identifying as Native peoples, we will always identify as the communities that we come from, right? Dene is who I am and who I always will be. There has been a lot of conversations about blood quantum, like how much Native are you? Like and being able to connect to one specific or be enrolled with one specific tribe versus being enrolled in another tribe. You can't be enrolled in two. You have to choose. So for a lot of tribal people who are mixed identities, they have to choose if they're going to be either Ute or Navajo if their parents are from both nations. That concept of enrolling is a federal push to identify and count Native nations in an effort to diminish the numbers of Native nations. We personally, as Native tribes, don't need to be counted. We don't count ourselves, right? If we're enrolled in one tribe, we are still accountable to the tribes that we belong to by blood, not necessarily by federal or state enrollment. But I would say generally most people feel an obligation to the tribes that they come from, but also connect more with what they were raised with, which sometimes is complicated because we also have the relocation era where multiple tribal nations were asked to leave their reservations or leave their spaces in order to take up an assimilated lifestyle in the cities that I mentioned. In addition to that, some of the other complications are like the 60s swoop, where children were taken from their front yards and just put into the foster program with white families because it was considered better as a social worker to have a Native child raised by a white family than it was to have them raised by a Native family. So that ability to connect to those communities is often complicated, and that process of identification and connection are an ongoing process for multiple people. Just because there's been an onslaught of assimilation forces on all of the Native communities, that ability to reconnect sometimes comes at a higher cost for some people over others. But generally, we connect with the nations that we come from and the ones we connect with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. I'm wondering for like the Native communities here, what is the next step? Like, what are you guys' goals in changing politics or changing certain things about the American government? I don't know how to ask it, but what would be like the future for you guys?
I like that. Every Native person is investing in positive change that they are contributing to. For some people, it's getting a degree, it's being a counselor, it's being a teacher, it's being in the medical field. For some people, It is surviving every day with the weight of the historical trauma that they have been given because of the boarding school era and assimilation policies that have occurred. Personally, as far as moving forward and change, every Native is doing it in their own way, but we need allies, right? We still, despite this era of resurgence, the middle-class white male still holds dominance in all of the spaces where that change needs to occur. We need allies. We need people who can connect and understand where we're coming from and elevate our voices and our issues. I always encourage people to look into whatever it is you personally are passionate about or what your career is connected to. In every single space, there is a Native issue or a Native concept or policy that we are trying to work for that you can help be an ally with. And it's across every field, whether it's education or medicine or policy or law or land back, like it doesn't matter. Every single space that we are in, every single space, we're everywhere. There's something for us to push or regain or to reacquire in every space that you can think of.
Thank you so much for your questions. Just want to remind you that there is a interactive land map outside where you can see indigenous places and indigenous place names and interact with that and see where you belong in that context. So thank you again to Desi. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Our next session will be at noon, so if you're able to stick around, great. Thank you.
Thank you again.